Everybody. Today we are going to be talking about one of the most common things that I see that perpetuate chronic pain, and that is the boom bust cycle. You may not have heard it called this, but I know that you know what it is. Let me introduce myself. My name is Amy Eicher. I'm a chronic pain coach, and I help motivated women get back to lives they love through the use of education, movement, and self-discovery. Let's start with the education. All right. So I know you've done this, right? So you've had a string of increased pain days. You've been resting. You've been laying in bed, possibly writhing. I get it. And then you start to feel better. And you look around at all that hasn't been done. You look at all the things you need to do for your kids, your partner, yourself, your job, your dog, your cat, you name it, right? And you do all the things that you haven't done because you've been laid up with a flare. And then maybe for a period, you're pretty proud of yourself and you're feeling good. And then you wake up the next morning and crash or bust, if you will. The flare up comes and you're feeling crappy and you're back down for days. In a nutshell, that's the boom bust cycle. It's really all about extremes. It's when we push ourselves beyond our limits during the boom phase, which is usually driven with a mix of enthusiasm and guilt or the pressure to perform. And they can be very productive. These periods can be very productive, but they are not sustainable because you are pushing past your available limit, if you will, whether it's your cardio ability, your strength, your endurance, you're pushing past it. It's basically like you have the ability within you to run a 5K, but instead of running a 5K, you chose to run the marathon. You don't have the things that you need to be able to do that. You haven't trained for that. And so when you try to do the equivalent in your life with simple activities of daily living, you know, kind of the same thing happens that would happen if you were training for, like if you were trained for a 5K and you tried to run a marathon, right? Everybody looks at that and goes, that's a terrible idea. That's exactly what boom busting is. All right. So you know this, but that boom bust cycle, it gets into everything, right? And its consequences get into everything. It gets into our work, it gets into our parenting, it gets into our partnerships, it cuts into whatever ability to exercise that we have, it cuts into our self-care and our home care and all of the things. And it pushes us back into patterns that hurt us instead of help us. And like, I think worse than all of that is usually at the bust part, we also start to feel the guilt and the shame because, well, everybody else can do this. Why can't I do this? Right? And I talk about guilt and shame in my blog and in a lot of other places, but the reality is guilt and shame, particularly shame, makes for an unsafe nervous system, which makes it more likely that we're going to have increased pain. And it also makes it harder to heal from our pain when our nervous system is constantly jazzed up, right? All right. So are you recognizing yourself in the boom bust cycle? Do you know when to stop? Do you know when you've gone too far? Do you know how to pace? That's the magic word. Do you know how to pace? Do you know how to ask for help? Let's look at why this pattern is problematic, beyond just the obvious that it causes us increased pain, right? Most of my clients live in this boom bust cycle and they don't even realize that they're living in it, right? It leads to pain, it leads to guilt, it leads to shame, it leads to feelings of this is purpose, that like this life has no purpose. I'm never going to get better. because it's always like this. Whenever I try, it backfires. Well, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. But the thing is, it would be like that for anyone, right? So that person that's trained for the 5K that goes to run a half marathon or a marathon, they too are going to fall apart. It's not going to work for them either. So it's not because you're in pain that it's not working. It's because you're pushing past the limits that you have. When you continually push past your body's limits, it takes longer and longer to recover. And as we go through the cycle, the pain generally gets more intense because we get more frustrated that we can't do. And the longer we're in that cycle, the closer together they usually get. And so usually we kind of have like a boom bust rest. But after you've been in pain for a while and you've been so limited by your pain, those cycles get shorter and shorter, and then they take longer and longer to recover from. And so it seems like our pain is getting worse and worse. I don't know about you, but that puts me on an emotional roller coaster. And I think it would any sane human being, right? We feel good, we feel upbeat, we feel positive when we're having a good day, when we're accomplishing our goals, right? The dopamine of being able to check that stuff off is fantastic for us. But when it's followed by a bust, by a collapse, by a pain flare, depression, disappointment, and the melancholy of what feels like failure comes on. Many of my clients, and I know I experienced it this way, but feel like you're being punished. How many times have you said to yourself, well, I shouldn't have done that? Or, well, I did this thing and now I'm paying for it, right? When you're thinking to yourself, I did this thing and now I'm paying for it, that's a form of internal punishment. You're not being punished for trying to go out with your friends. Your body is telling you you did more than you're capable of. You have to build up from where you are so that you can do that thing that you want to do. We talked about how each time we go through this boom bust cycle, it takes longer and longer to get back to our baseline. And that usually ends up with increase in pain, really a feeling of burnout. And it can often lead to fatigue. So now we're not just in pain, but we're also exhausted. Do you find that you end up in boom bust cycles because of a pressure that you may feel internally or externally, depending on your friends and family, but to perform, to please, to do what others are asking of you? I think of this moment after my surgery. So back in 2011, I didn't know anything about pain science. I was hopeful that the surgery I had was going to fix me, and it did not. And I even wrote about this in my memoir because it was so poignant, right? So I'm like 6 weeks post-op and I am super struggling with mobility. I had less mobility and less capability after surgery than I had before, which was objectively terrifying. But my parents had stayed with us for a month because my kids were little at the time and I just needed the extra help. And they took me to one of my favorite types of restaurants. I love the cook in front of you Japanese. I think it's very yummy. But it's also a really long meal, right? Like all the showmanship takes time, and it's not a quick sit down meal. Well, sitting was something that still tended to really inflame my pelvic girdle. And I didn't want to be unappreciative to my parents who were taking me out to my favorite restaurant. And I did not yet have skills to really say, no, why don't you guys go and maybe bring that back for me? I did not have the capability at that time to do that. So I am growing more and more uncomfortable. And it felt like somebody, at that point in time, it felt like somebody was just filling my whole pelvic girdle. So like inside my pelvis and my butt cheeks and my hips with like really heavy water. And it felt congested. I don't know how else to describe it, but I could feel this pressure mounting inside of my body. And I didn't know how to say, I can't sit here anymore. I need to go. That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about when I say our beliefs and our attitudes drive our behavior. I knew it was not in my best interest to continue sitting there, but it took someone else intervening for me when they noticed that my face like was really contorting and starting to look like I was in pain. And they said, okay, thanks for dinner. I'm going to take Amy home now. And that was a good choice. But I couldn't do that for myself because of my need to please, my need to be a good girl, like all of these things to not disappoint my parents, to appear normal, right? I knew I was in pain. I knew I needed to stop. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the internal pressures I felt to please and to be the good girl and to do these things to, for a myriad of reasons. But that's why the emotional work is so important when it comes to healing your chronic pain, because a lot of the decisions that we make that keep us in pain, like that dinner, had nothing to do with my physical body. They had to do with the way that I was thinking about things, right? Okay. Another reason that we get into the boom bust cycle is because we cannot feel what's happening in our bodies, right? So that's called interoception, and to not have it is poor interoception, but it means the ability to recognize what you are feeling emotionally as well as physically. Okay, so if you are cleaning the house and jamming out to your favorite tunes, and everything like you're doing the thing and you're not really paying attention to the signs and symptoms that your body is giving you. For instance, that feeling of pressure starting to build in my pelvis, I could recognize that. But if I hadn't been able to recognize that, I wouldn't have known that I shouldn't keep sitting, right? So we have to be able to pay attention to our own bodies so that we know when we're pushing them past the limit. Now, many of you are probably watching this thinking, but Amy, it doesn't come on until the next day. I understand. I understand. And that's another reason that pacing is the solution to boom bust, but we'll get to that in a second, right? So we need to be able to pay attention to, we need to know what's going on mentally so that we can make boundaries around when we've gone too far. We need to know what our we need to know what our limits are. And we also need to know what it feels like when we should stop. Then we also need the ability to ask for help, which many people interpret as weakness and like something that we're not supposed to do. We're supposed to be self-sufficient, right? No, I'm just going to say no. I'm going to say no, we're not. We're not supposed to be self-sufficient. We are a herd animal. We are not supposed to live in isolation. We are not supposed to be able to do everything by ourselves. And it is that perception that also drives our pain, because we don't do the things that we should do if we want to get out of pain. And that's a lot of that is going to be asking for help or saying no. All right. Do you recognize yourself in any of those things? Do you recognize that those may be some behaviors that you're participating in that are driving your boom bust cycle? I have mentioned a couple times that pacing is the solution to booming and busting. And pacing sounds like it's like just a no-brainer, right? Like, I don't know how many times I've heard physical therapists or really even like orthopedic doctors say, well, you just need to pace and then that'll make it better. I thought I was pacing, but I was not. My pacing was a boom bust cycle. And for many of my clients, they're finding the same. They think they're pacing, but instead they're just booming and busting. Pacing, I love it as a literary term. So like when you think of the pacing of a story, right? It is the rhythm at which the story progresses to build to the conclusion or the end. It also keeps it keeps the book interesting. It keeps things interesting. It keeps us wanting to read to see what happens next without giving us too much information or too little information. And that's a really good illustration of what pacing for pain is. I want to be clear that there are really two types of pacing. There is one for chronic pain. There's one for chronic pain, which is what we're talking about. And then pacing takes on a whole new meaning if you are dealing with chronic fatigue and symptoms of energy production issues. Okay. So I know that we can feel very tired with chronic pain. Chronic fatigue is a whole different beast, and you may be experiencing both. But when it comes to pacing for chronic fatigue, that is not what I am talking about. And the things that I am talking about could actually be harmful to you. So I want to if I had red lights that I could wave, I would do that right now. But I am talking about pacing for chronic pain. Pacing for chronic fatigue is a lot of heart rate pacing, and it's a lot of trial and error. So I encourage you to, if that is your case and fatigue is a bigger issue than pushing past your pain, I encourage you to look into that. I am certain that YouTube has a plethora of videos on heart rate pacing for chronic fatigue. But we're going to talk about it in terms of chronic pain, right? So we're not aware that the pain's coming. We're not aware that we're doing more than we can handle. Maybe we're not really considering the different types of input that we have going on that's making things harder. But what we're doing with pacing is, the first thing we're doing is we're assessing how much energy, how much uptime we have during a day. Then we assess the things we need to do. And then we fill it in the time slots. And it's kind of who's the lady, Marie Kondo, like of cleaning, or like of thinning things out. Like oftentimes there is a hatcheting process that one has to go through to clean up your life enough to fit it into the space that you have when you start. But the point of pacing is not to like downsize to stay there. It's to downsize to get a handle on life so that we can slowly begin to increase our abilities, right? If we do things in a measured way, much like training for athletics, we get a lot further, we gain capacity, we gain more time, we gain more strength, we gain more endurance, right? That's what we want. That's how we transform a life that is made smaller by pain back into something that's worth living, back into something that's important to us, back into something that has value. So the answer to boom busting is pacing. Pacing, as I said, is not always as clear cut as people think. If you are seeing this video in April or before May 9th of 2024, I am offering a course on pacing. It's called The Art of Pacing, because it is an art. And I will be there in the live version to give you as much help as you can possibly need. We're going to personalize things to you. And there is also a DIY version of this course where I'm going to talk to you just like this. I'm going to give you all the information you need. And then you get to figure it out. You get to do it through trial and error. And you know what? If you need to speak with me, you can always just book a consult. So you get as much or as little of me as you need to figure out how to stop boom busting your way through life so that your life can be more full and full of meaning. So I'm going to leave a link for that course at the bottom of this video. And I would love to know, If you see yourself in the boom bust, do you know why you do it? And if you're already pacing and you're having success with that, would you please share with the others watching this video how you pace so that we can learn from each other? I would love to be able to build a community in our comments section. As always, there is more information on the boom bust cycle at my website, good Lord, www.restoringvenus.com/pacing. And I'll leave that link below so you can just go right to the website and read the rest of all of the things that go along with boom busting and a little bit more about pacing if you are interested. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I will see you next week.